The lights in the studio were blinding. The air, thick and still, carried a silence so loud it felt like thunder. The U.S.-Africa Policy Forum was being broadcast live in over 30 countries. Every seat was filled with world leaders, diplomats, journalists. Cameras were locked in. Pens hovered above notepads. But no one was writing. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat on the panel, dressed sharply in his military uniform. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't angry. His voice, when he spoke moments earlier, had been steady, calm, deliberate. He talked about Africa's future, sovereignty, unity, justice, not with fury, but with precision. He didn't demand attention. He commanded it. And then it happened. From the other side of the table, Nancy Pelosi leaned forward. Her smile was thin, half smug, half daring. Her voice sliced through the silence. "You sound as dumb as Africa." The air snapped. A gasp escaped from somewhere in the audience. One journalist dropped their pen. Even the moderator blinked in disbelief. The insult didn't echo. It landed hard. Final. Cameras zoomed in. Every eye turned to Traoré. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Not even a muscle on his face moved. He just stared back at her, quiet, composed. But behind that stillness, there was something stronger, something ancient, a storm that had waited centuries. And then, slowly, he reached for his microphone. The sound of his fingers brushing the mic rang louder than any shout. The room held its breath. Was he going to erupt, fire back, walk out? But Traoré simply sat taller. He adjusted the mic, cleared his throat. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to pierce steel, he said, "Madam Speaker, you just insulted over 1 billion people." A ripple swept through the studio. Not noise, emotion. Pelosi's expression froze. But Traoré didn't stop. His tone remained soft. But something in it shifted. Not volume weight. As if his words carried something older than politics. Older than the room. And the world listened. Because what followed next wasn't a response. It was a reckoning. The words had landed. Not like a headline, but like a stone in glass. You just insulted over 1 billion people. The weight of it hung in the air, like smoke after an explosion. No one moved. No one dared. Nancy Pelosi blinked. Once, her smile faltered just slightly, but it was enough. The cameras caught it all. Every twitch. Every breath. Captain Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave his hands. Instead, he looked directly at her with the same calm that had made his earlier speech unforgettable. "You speak of Africa as if it's a joke," he said, voice like steel, wrapped in velvet. "But the children you mock, they're mining the cobalt that powers your phones, farming the cocoa in your favorite chocolate." Bleeding in silence, while the world turns its cameras away. A soft gasp escaped from the back row. Pelosi opened her mouth. Maybe to interrupt, but Traoré raised a single hand. Not with force. With finality. "Let me finish." Even the moderator stayed quiet. The room had shifted. This was no longer a forum. It was a courtroom. And Traoré wasn't defending. He was testifying. "You call us dumb," he continued. Eyes steady. "But who rewrote our history? With chains. Who came to our lands with flags and left with gold. Who taught us lies and named it civilization." In the audience, that one Chain. But who rewrote our history? With chains at. Who rewrote our history? A young African student wiped away a tear. Across the globe. Social media erupted. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. The clip spread like wildfire. Hashtags flooded timelines. Number, respect Africa. Traoré speaks. Number, Pelosi shamed. But inside the room, it was still quiet. The only sound was Traoré's voice level. Unwavering. I was born in a village with no electricity. He said, my mother taught me math by candlelight. My father died defending our land. My sister cried herself to sleep because her teacher left for Europe. For better pay. His voice cracked, but just slightly. Enough to make the silence feel holy. One American analyst in the audience pulled off his glasses. He wasn't hiding his tears. Traoré looked straight ahead, not just at Pelosi, but beyond her. I don't speak from books, he said quietly. I speak from pain. And in that moment, the world wasn't watching a debate. They were witnessing a man carry the soul of a continent without raising his voice. Just when the room thought it had heard everything, Traoré leaned forward. Voice softer now. Not broken, but personal. There's something I haven't told you yet, he said. Something I've never said on a stage like this. The tension tightened again. Journalists glanced at each other. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. I want to tell you about my brother. His name was Issa. Silence returned, this time different. This wasn't diplomacy anymore. It was grief. Walking into the room uninvited, he was my best friend. My shadow. He had this laugh loud. Messy. Impossible to ignore. He dreamed of becoming a teacher. Of building a school in our village. Traoré paused. His eyes flickered, but didn't close. But when violence came, it wasn't outsiders who took him. It was our own. Men who wore the same uniform meant to protect him. Gasps swept through the crowd. He vanished. Just disappeared. For months. We searched. Prayed. Cried into pillows at night, like it would somehow bring him home. His voice dropped low. And then, one day, he came back. Traoré looked down. Jaw tightening. But it wasn't Issa anymore. His body was there. But his spirit was somewhere else. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He couldn't sleep without shaking. A shiver ran through the audience. The scars on his body were nothing compared to the ones in his eyes. A woman in the front row wiped a tear. That is the Africa you don't see. Traoré said, not in your newspapers. Not on your evening broadcasts. He turned his head. Slowly. Scanning the room. The Africa you insult, Madam Speaker, is bleeding, surviving, hoping. For a moment, even Pelosi didn't move. Her smile was gone. Traoré's voice steadied again. Like a drumbeat beneath pain. I ask you to imagine losing your brother not to death, but to silence, to fear, to injustice. He glanced at the moderator, who didn't interrupt. I've met mothers who bury their children, not in graves, but in memories no one will name. Villages emptied by war, by hunger. While the world sips coffee and scrolls past, he looked directly at the camera now. But in all this darkness, there is light. There is courage. There is hope. And just like that, the conversation changed. Forever. The studio didn't breathe. Captain Traoré Let the silence sit for a moment heavy, charged, sacred. Then, with calm precision, he asked the one thing no one expected. If we are so dumb, why do we keep rising? His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The silence did the lifting. Why do we still build schools when the world funds weapons? Why do our children still sing when their classrooms have no walls? Why do we still love a world that forgets us? One by one, heads began to lower. Eyes dropped to the floor. You mock us. But you've never had to choose between clean water and tuition. You've never had to watch your mother sell her wedding ring to buy medicine for your sister. He turned toward Pelosi, but spoke past her. We are called primitive. But who taught us war? Who taught us greed? Who taught us shame? The crowd was frozen. Journalists had stopped taking notes. They were listening now not as press, but as people. You speak of Africa like a broken child. Traoré continued. But we are not broken. We are recovering from centuries of erasure, of theft, of being told our pain didn't count. His voice didn't waver, but his words cut like truth. Only can. Do you know what strength looks like? Madam Speaker, he didn't wait for an answer. It's a girl walking 10 miles just to get to school. A farmer growing food in soil, left dry by the climate, others ruined. A nurse working without gloves, still saving lives. A man in the audience, once stoic, buried his face in his hands. You call us backward, but we've built forward through every storm thrown at us. He paused again. Let the moment stretch. You see, we don't need pity. We don't need charity. Then, with a sharp stillness that felt like thunder, we need respect. The crowd stirred. Someone clapped once. Then again. It grew. Cautiously, like people weren't sure if they were allowed to cheer for truth. Traoré stood steady. If we are dumb, Madam Speaker, then why does our courage scare you? The question didn't need an answer, because it wasn't a question at all. It was a mirror. And suddenly, the world couldn't look away. Captain Traoré didn't move, but his presence filled the room like a rising tide. Pelosi sat still, her hands clasped tightly, jaw locked. The smile that once danced on her lips had vanished. Now, she was quiet, but it wasn't out of respect, it was retreat. You called us dumb, Traoré said, voice calm, almost tender. But it is your ignorance that blinds you. He wasn't speaking just to her anymore. He was speaking to the world. You don't see the brilliance in a mother who can feed 5 children with 1 bowl of rice. The genius in a boy who builds a windmill from scrap just to bring light to his village. You don't see it because you don't look. Each word carved through the silence, like lightning through still air. You think strength comes from money, from weapons, from walls. But real strength, it's in the ones who keep standing after everything has been taken. He turned toward the audience, toward the cameras, toward the millions watching. Africa is not a place to mock. It is not a punchline. It is not your metaphor for failure. He let that sink in. It is our home, our history, our inheritance. And we are not asking for validation. We are demanding recognition. His voice didn't rise, but it grew louder in hearts. For centuries, we have been rewritten, repackaged, reduced. Then, slowly, his eyes locked with Pelosi's again. But today, we reclaim the pen. That was the moment it shifted. One by one, people stood, quietly, respectfully, like witnesses to something they knew they'd never forget. Some had tears in their eyes. Others just stared frozen by truth. Even the moderator couldn't speak. His notes sat untouched on the desk in front of him. And yet, Traoré wasn't done. "I am not here to humiliate you. I'm here to wake you." He looked down for a breath, then back up with a calm fire in his eyes. "We've been underestimated before. And still, we rise." It wasn't applause that followed. It was a silence so deep, so charged. It felt sacred, because sometimes the loudest moments in history are the ones where no one says a word. And in that silence, Africa stood tall through him. The forum had ended, but the world had not moved on. Outside the studio, headlines lit up. Like wildfire, Captain Traoré. Confront Pelosi live. The billion voices she tried to dismiss. But inside, something deeper stirred. Back in his hotel room, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat alone by the window. The city outside was glowing, buzzing, oblivious. But in his heart, the silence was louder than applause. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. Did it matter? Did the world really hear? He wasn't celebrating. He was remembering. He thought of Isa, his broken brother. He thought of his mother, lighting candles in the dark, whispering prayers over her children before dawn. He thought of the soldiers still sleeping on dirt floors back home, holding rifles in one hand and hope in the other. His phone buzzed. Then again, and again, messages from every corner of the globe. Some in English, some in French, most in hope. "You gave us a voice. Thank you for speaking for us. I finally saw myself in your words." But it wasn't the likes or retweets that mattered. It was the one message from a boy in a dusty village in northern Burkina Faso. "Captain, my teacher showed us your video. Today, I stood up in class. I want to be like you." Traoré closed his eyes. The tears didn't fall, but they rose. He knew what this moment meant. It wasn't politics. It wasn't publicity. It was a turning point carved out of pain. In the markets of Ouagadougou, vendors were replaying the speech on tiny radios. In remote towns, families gathered under starlight, listening like it was gospel. Back in the U.S., commentators debated what it all meant. Some defended Pelosi. Others condemned her. But none could ignore the shift. This wasn't about party lines anymore. It was about perception. Traoré hadn't raised his voice, but he had raised a mirror. And millions, maybe for the first time, saw Africa not as a statistic, not as a charity, but as a heartbeat. He looked out the window one last time before bed. The sky was quiet. But he knew storms don't always come with thunder. Sometimes they come with truth. And that truth was just getting started. The world saw a leader. What they didn't see was the weight. Behind the suit. Behind the calm gaze and steady voice. Captain Traoré carried something few could name: the quiet agony of responsibility. Each day after the forum, his inbox flooded, but not with congratulations. With pleas. "My son disappeared in the north. Can you help? My village has no water. Captain, please, they took my husband." He read every message. Everyone. And at night, he didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling in silence, haunted not by nightmares, but by choices. Who to help first, who to call, who to save, when there weren't enough hands, because leadership, for Traoré, wasn't a stage. It was a battlefield, without guns fought in meetings. In empty rooms. In decisions no one applauds. Back home, children whispered his name like a myth. Ibrahim. They said, "He speaks for us." But myths don't bleed. And he bled just not where cameras could see. He had no time to grieve Isa. No space to mourn the thousands lost to hunger, war, and silence. Instead, he stood tall for them. Always for them. At times, even hope felt heavy. They cheer now. He once whispered to his aide, "But what if I fail them tomorrow?" But then he'd hear a voice. His mother's, soft and steady. "You were not born to be worshipped. My son, you were born to serve." So he kept moving. He visited schools without roofs. Saturday beside grandmothers who had outlived their children, held the hands of soldiers who had no legs left to stand. And through it all, he carried their pain like armor. Because when the world insulted Africa, they didn't just insult a continent. They insulted every mother who taught her child to read under a flickering candle. Every father who planted seeds in dry earth, praying for rain and peace. And Traoré, he remembered them all. He wore no crown. He held no scepter. But his silence in the face of cruelty had become a banner. And the world. The world had no choice but to follow where that banner waved. Even if they didn't yet understand the cost. The days after the forum were anything but quiet. News anchors across continents replayed Traoré's words on loop. Panelists debated his tone, his message, his presence. Some called him powerful, others dangerous. But none could ignore him. Yet Traoré wasn't watching the headlines. He was walking barefoot across a village courtyard, listening to a teacher describe how her students now stood taller, how they started drawing maps of Africa with pride instead of shame. He didn't need applause. He needed progress. While political commentators bickered on primetime television, Traoré sat in classrooms where the chalk was running out, where students shared desks, where hope had to stretch. "They talk about me like I'm a movement," he told a local elder. But movements don't mean anything unless they move someone forward. In marketplaces, vendors played clips from the forum on small radios, nodding to each other with quiet reverence. Across the Atlantic, people had begun asking questions, not just about what Pelosi said, but why it hit so hard. Because Traoré hadn't just responded with facts. He responded with something deeper presence. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He stood still. And in that stillness, he rewrote everything they thought they knew about leadership. When asked by reporters if he'd demand an apology from Pelosi, he simply said, "I don't seek apologies. I seek awareness." He wasn't there to win a soundbite. He was there to turn the world's gaze, to force it to see what it had long ignored. And in doing so, he became more than a soldier, more than a president. He became a mirror for every nation that once looked at Africa with pity or worse, with prideful ignorance. Now, that mirror looked back, and what it reflected was undeniable dignity. Not in speeches, not in slogans, but in quiet resilience, because while some leaders rule with fear and others with power, Traoré ruled with something rarer: truth. And truth, when spoken without rage, becomes unstoppable. Not because it's loud, but because it doesn't flinch. And that's why the world couldn't stop listening. In the weeks that followed, Captain Traoré never once raised his voice, yet somehow, it kept echoing. He didn't return to the spotlight. He returned to the people. No entourage. No grand speeches. Just quiet footsteps on dusty roads. Through markets buzzing with life. Through classrooms where the walls were cracked, but the dreams were whole. At a rural school, a young girl tugged at his sleeve. "Sir," she whispered. "Is it true what you said? That I matter?" He knelt. Eye to eye. "Yes," he said. "More than the world has ever told you." That was his revolution. Not in declarations. In conversations. He met with fishermen who'd lost their waters to pollution. Farmers planting seeds with nothing but faith. Nurses who hadn't been paid in months, but still showed up every morning. Each time, he didn't promise miracles. He promised memory. "I see you," he said, "and I will not forget." Meanwhile, international media scrambled to keep up. Was this man a threat, a savior, a symbol? But Traoré refused their labels. He belonged to no narrative, but his people's. He was strength, but not the kind that shouts. His strength was in not clapping back on Twitter, in not demanding retractions, in not needing revenge to feel resolved. He was building something larger than a response. He was building trust. And that trust spread like wildfire without hashtags. Without campaigns. It was in the way a grandfather in Senegal stood straighter. The way a street vendor in Ghana added a flag to her stall. The way a teacher in Malawi rewrote her lesson plan with a new chapter, Modern African Leadership. He had become a force not of protest, but of presence. And in a world addicted to noise, Traoré silence roared. Even those who once dismissed him found themselves repeating his words. Not because they agreed, but because they couldn't forget. We've been underestimated before. And still, we rise. That line now lived on signs. On walls. On the tongues of a generation awakening. Traoré had reminded the world that strength wasn't always about shouting down your enemies. Sometimes, it was about standing so still, so rooted, that the world had no choice but to stop and listen. And that's exactly what it did. Weeks after the forum, Captain Traoré stood in the heart of Ouagadougou, surrounded by candles flickering in the twilight. Each flame represented a name, not a number, a life lost to conflict, to hunger, to neglect. He didn't speak to the cameras. He didn't call a press conference. He just stood there still, present, grounded, and around him, a nation breathed. Children clutched their parents' hands. Elders closed their eyes. Vendors stopped counting coins. For a moment, time bowed its head. And then, he whispered, "We carry the past, but we are building the future." It wasn't a speech. It was a prayer. In a nearby village, an old woman sat by a fire. Her grandchildren gathered close. "That man," she said, pointing to the radio, "he carries our pain and our strength." One child looked up, eyes wide. "Will he help us?" "Grandma," she smiled through tears. "He already has." Traoré had become more than a man. He was a reminder that history wasn't over. That dignity could be defended without shouting. That truth, when wrapped in grace, could shift the air. And it did. Young Africans across the continent shared the clip of his speech like sacred scripture. They weren't sharing anger. They were sharing identity. "This is who we are." One student wrote, "This is who we've always been." But, behind closed doors, Traoré carried a scattered truth. He still read every letter, still met with mothers who lost sons, still made choices no heart should have to make. He bore it all, not because he was invincible, but because he refused to be invisible. And so, the movement grew not in parades, but in classrooms, not with fireworks, but with open notebooks. A continent didn't rise on rage. It rose on resolve. At a youth rally, Traoré stood before thousands. No podium, no armor. Just a man with a voice and a promise. "This is our Africa," he said. "Not the one they mocked. The one we build every day. With courage. With love. With strength." The crowd erupted not with noise, but with tears. With cheers. With silence full of meaning. And somewhere, in every corner of the earth, Africa stood taller. Because one man dared to speak softly. And the whole world heard.